Hi, I'm Vicky. I'm glad you're here. Today I have a budget-friendly watercolor kit that comes mainly from Kmart and the dollar store, and some of the items are just from your own kitchen and recycling. So this is what we're going to be using today, and I'm going to show you lots of beginner techniques if you are an absolute beginner at watercolor, or you would just like to get into it but think it might be too expensive for you. Things like these recycled glass jars from the kitchen, some masking tape from the dollar store, brushes and watercolor paper from Kmart, dollar store bottle of spritzing, or spritzing bottle, I should say, for spritzing water, some paper towel, some tissues, and a large pair of scissors, a ruler, a pencil, an eraser. This is just masking tape that I get from the dollar store. It's $2.50 a roll. And the eraser and pencil sharpener came from Kmart. The brushes are from Kmart. So is the 2B pencil for drawing your lines with. These are the two brushes I've chosen to use today. I have a flat brush, which is a size 14, and a round brush, which is a size 6. And these other brushes were from Kmart as well. So there's a whole selection of brushes there. So these are the two I'm using today. I'm going to be doing everything with just those two brushes, but the other brushes that I have that I got from Kmart are a long round size 8, a massive size 22 round, a filbert brush which has a different sort of a tip on it. It has more of a curved edge on it rather than a pointed edge. That's in a 12, and a really large flat wash brush which is a size 22. So I'll be using the flat brush in size 14 and the round brush in a size 6. And this is watercolor pad is from Kmart as well. It's 10 sheets and it is massive. These paints that I'm using today are from Micador, and I bought these at my local dollar store. I really like these paints. They're very high staining, so they're quite opaque when you use them. And you can see there's a plastic palette that you can use if you wanted to mix your colours together. I don't know that I'll be using that plastic palette today. But if you're a beginner, I would like you to be able to get into watercolour without having to spend a whole lot of money. Kmart also have tube paints in watercolour. I think the palette paints are easier. The paper that I'm using is the watercolor pad from Kmart. It's rough textured on one side and it's smooth textured on the other. So I'm using my T-square ruler, and I'm just going to trim down that rough edge where I tore the pages with my scissors, and I'm going to cut each of those pieces in half. So I end up with 4 pages. I'm folding each of the 4 pages in half. I'm using the edge of those scissors, which is sort of like a bone folder. You don't need to go out and buy a bone folder, just use the edge of your scissors. And you can see when I open this up what a really nice crease that gives. So you have 4 pieces that you cut down from those 2 larger pieces of watercolor pad. That watercolor pad I think is wonderful in that it's large. But for a beginner, I think it can be quite frustrating to have a huge piece of paper to work on. I think this is going to create a much better little booklet. In fact, you could call this an art journal. It's very simple to bind it. I'm just using a couple of staples. You don't need a stapler, you just need 2 staples and a thumbtack. And I'm marking with my pencil how wide that staple is end to end, and I'm just eyeballing it roughly along the spine, not bothering to measure it, just keeping it free and easy. And when I have my marks, I'm going to line up the papers and push that thumbtack through all the way to the other side, and then in the other mark for the other edge of where the staple will go. Now I'm just going to pop the staple in there, in those holes that I've already pushed through. Turn it over, grab those scissors and use the end of the scissors to close the ends of the staples. Now, how easy is this for binding a book? Doesn't get much simpler. So I'm turning it around and doing the other side in the same way, coming from the outside spine in towards the centre. Or you could use a needle and thread and sew this together if you didn't have staples. But you can see what a great technique this is. So we now have a 16-page booklet made from 2 sheets of that very large watercolour pad from Kmart. And each of the pages has a smooth side or a rough side, depending on which way you folded them. So now I'm bringing back that masking tape, and I'm going to create a spine just by laying it over those staples on the outside. And then I'm going to do the same on the inside pages, and that way the staples will be covered. And I'm going to bring those scissors back in and trim that off. And here is your homemade art journal. And this is the book I'll be showing you all the techniques for beginner watercolorists. So let's get started. I'm going to start by waking up my paints by spritzing them with water from the water bottle. And I'm taking that pencil, holding it quite a ways up towards the end of the pencil and just drawing very sketchy rectangles, very loose and light. I want 6 rectangles on the left-hand page, and this is where we're going to do our flat brush techniques. So I'm taking that flat brush, which is the Kmart number 14 flat brush, and I'm going to do a wet in wet gradient wash, which means I've painted the rectangle with water. I'm going to spray my paints again because they've started to dry out again in the heat. I'm going to pick a colour that I like. You can choose whatever colour you like. And I'm going to use that flat brush to create a gradient wash, which means it will be darker at the top and it will gradually fade away towards the bottom of that rectangle. And making it wet in wet to begin with means you won't get any cauliflowers or hard edges on it because the paper is already wet. You won't get any harsh lines either. So there's our first little rectangle. I'm just going to move that up so that you can see all those lovely colours in the palette. This is a Micador palette that I purchased from the dollar store. And that palette at the front comes off. So I've removed that so you can see the colours a little bit closer. Now the next technique is going to be wet on dry flat wash. So I have water on my brush, but not on the paper. And I have a nice strong colour. And I'm just going to paint over the edges, side to side and up and down, and it creates a beautiful flat wash colour. Now the next technique is going to be a gradient 2-colour wash, and it's going to be wet on dry. So I'm starting with a nice strong yellow, adding some water and taking it about 2/3 of the way down towards the bottom of the rectangle. And then I'm taking a nice thick amount of the blue and I'm bringing that up towards the yellow. And as you know from colour theory, blue and yellow will create green. So this will create a 3rd colour. So we've mixed the 2 colours together, and it's a gradient wash, meaning that it doesn't have any harsh lines. So it will gradually move from the yellow on the top to the green in the middle to the blue on the bottom. And I'm just adding a little bit of water in there to soften that edge. If you go outside the lines, you can pick it up with a tissue, and the paint is still wet, so you can still correct that. Just make sure you don't introduce any of the blue into the yellow. You can see I've wiped my brush clean on the paper towel. And that's made a beautiful gradient 2-colour wash. Now the next technique is a lifting technique. So I'm choosing a nice blue colour, and this is wet on dry, or you could do this wet on wet. And what I'm going to do is to work quickly and make sure the paint doesn't have a chance to dry, that it's nice and moist. It has enough water in the brush to keep it wet. I'm going to bring in the tissue and I'm going to dab out. And you create these beautiful, easy clouds. So that's a fun technique. I use that quite a bit for skies. The next technique is thick lines or thick stripes using the flat edge of your flat brush. You can create beautiful, even stripes with this method. Look how simple that is. So easy. The next technique I'm going to use is thin stripes using the fine edge of the brush, turning it on its side. I'm just dabbing that off so it's not too wet. I have it on its side and I have the brush almost vertical. And you can see how thin the lines can be if you turn the brush to the side. It gives you beautiful fine lines as well. So that's all our techniques with the flat brush so far. And now I'm going to do the round brush techniques on the next page here. So I'm going to wash off my brush. It is very, very blue looking, but all the colour is out of it. The colours have actually stained the brush, but it's still okay to use. Now I'm going to use my pencil to draw some rough looking oval shapes, and the last one I'm going to put on its side. So 5 ovals that are upright and one on its side. So let's try the round brush techniques. So these are all done with the round brush size 6 from Kmart. So I'm going to make a wet oval here with the water first, and then I'm going to bring the colour in. And this is going to be a wet in wet flat wash. You can see how easy it is to create the curves with the rounded brush. It would be much more difficult to create rounded shapes with a flat brush. And I'm just colouring that shape in. It's very simple and makes a lovely flat wash. Now I'm going to use the wet on dry technique with a bit of lifting as well. I want this oval shape to look a bit rounded, as though it has a little bit of dimension to it and it's not just flat. So I'm making some nice gradients with my water. And you can take some of that colour out, either with a damp brush that has been dried off on some tissue, and that gives you like a two-tone effect. Or if you want it to look really rounded, you can bring in a tissue and, just like the cloud technique, just lift out an oval shape in the centre and then use your brush with a little bit of water on it to give you that beautiful rounded, almost like a pebble shape. The next technique with the round brush is curved lines. Curved lines are useful for making flowers like roses. These are like a reverse C-shaped curve. And the round brush works really well for this. And I'm just using that wet on dry. The next technique is thin and thick lines. So this is useful for leaves. You can press and release, press and release, press and release, and you get a thick line to a thin, to a thick, to a thin. You get that lovely, almost like a serpentine line. Looks a little bit like a snake, but it's great for leaves. Just learning that technique of putting more pressure on and lifting the pressure up gives you these lovely lines with a wavy shape in them. The next technique with a round brush is just dotting. So you can create dots very easily with a round brush. And I'm just going to dot all around the edge of that shape. I'm not being too precise or particular here. I'm just having fun with it. You could make very precise dots if you took your time. And that's just using the fine point of the round brush. I'm just adding a little bit more of what's left on my brush to darken up those lines that I made earlier. Now the next technique is straight and curved lines using the round brush. So I'm tipping this on its side. I like to draw lines pulling them towards me for thin lines. Often I'll turn my work around or onto its side so that I can pull the brush towards me. It just seems more comfortable. And now I'm drawing the thick lines around the outside. And I'm colouring in between the lines. So I'm using colouring in techniques there. Now the next technique on the oval that's lying on its side is shading wet in wet. And I had the idea that I'd like to create a three-dimensional shape here too. So I'm going for a lemon. So I'm getting a nice lemon yellow, adding that to the wet in wet, painting that around. And to add the shading, I'm going to pick a darker colour, that lovely ochre brown, and just put some dots into the wet paint, and they will spread out because it's very wet. We're working wet in wet here. And I'm mainly putting the dots on the bottom, which is where the shading would be, and then I'm putting a bit of a shaded area where the stem of the lemon would have been, and just a few little more dots around the bottom, bit of a line there so that it looks like a shadow, and a few more little dots on the skin to give it that pitted look, and a few more little dots at the top just to finish it off. Now the final technique is going to be glazing. Now I've just checked that red shape and it is dry, so I'm able to come back in with a nice deep tone. I'm going to use a nice deep strong blue over the top of that red. Again, I'm turning it around just because it's easier for me to draw stripes towards myself than sideways. And I'm just putting some dashes on the red shape. This is called glazing, where you put one colour over the top of another when the first layer is completely dry. And you can tell if your paint's dry by touching it, yes, but if it feels cold to the touch, it means it's still slightly damp. So you want the painted areas to be the same temperature as the paper around it. And there's our glazing technique with a round brush. Now I'm going to use the flat brush and I'm going to draw a picture for you. So I'm going to draw the easiest tree you could possibly imagine. I'm starting by putting some branches facing upwards, then facing horizontally and then facing downwards and creating a bit of a rough shape. Turning it on its side. This is all done with the flat brush. And this is a really easy way to make pine trees. And I'm just dabbing at it and changing the angle slightly so that they are all different angles, leaving some white space there. Adding a few more to the top and out to the sides and giving the tree a little bit more shape. You can see I'm just using that paintbrush almost in a vertical position and just tapping, moving a little bit from side to side, from up and down, changing it around a bit. There's a tree. Couldn't be simpler. That's the easiest tree you'll ever make. Now I have a little bit of grey and it's quite wet, and I'm just going to create a shadow under the tree to make it look more realistic. So there's a pine tree. Next, I'm going to show you, using the round brush, how to create a really easy flower. And I'm going to show you how creamy this paint is when I get it out. It needs to be nice and thick without a whole lot of water in for this first stage. I'm going to draw 3 dots, and that's going to be the start of my flower. Then I'm taking some water and I'm pulling out the pigment away from the dots towards the outside and just pulling those out. And you can add a little bit more pigment there. You can pick up a little bit more of the pink. Pulling out the second dot into like a petal shape. And then the same with the third. I've just made a little blot there that I want to blot up with tissue. If you get to things with a tissue before they dry, you'll find you can lift most things off the paper. And I'm going to push these away from the centre for this petal. And I'm leaving a space between them. I don't want them to join up, otherwise they'll just look like a blob. So leaving that white space, just like I've done in the tree, is really important. Now I'm doing 3 more dots, and this is going to be a 6-petal flower. And I'm going to do exactly the same again. I'm going to pull out the pigment with some water. I'm dabbing it off on my paper towel or my tissue so it's not too wet. Otherwise it'll be too pale and you won't see the colours. And you can see the flower taking shape. The only thing you have to remember is to keep the petals separated so they're not actually touching. Now, a fun technique that you can use here is to select a colour for the centre, put it right in the middle, and then add a little bit of water to it to encourage it to bleed into each of the petals. And that is a really fun effect. I like that a lot. Now the flower needs some leaves, and I'm going to use that technique where I used the thin and thick lines to create a leaf. I'm pressing down and releasing, pressing down and releasing, and that creates my 2 leaves. See how easy that is? And now I'm just going to do a very, very faint line. It's going to be quite dry, this paint, because when you're trying to do thin lines, I want quite a thin stem. If you have too much water on, you'll get a thick stem. So I'm just almost dry brushing it to get it started. Now I'm adding some pigment and some water and just barely touching the tip of that brush to the page. And you can keep going over and make it thicker if you want to. It's very hard to go from thick back to thin though, so you want to start nice and light. Now I'm adding some of that green into the centre of the flower, and this does 2 things. It adds a lovely greenish grey tinge, but it also brings some of the colours around the painting. So there's my flat tree and my round flower. This is a painting I did using that flat brush method for pine trees. I painted this on a board, so it's on a timber board, a very thin timber plywood board, and I've let some of the board show through to look like sand in the front of this painting. With the flower, I have created some cards using buds and shading and different colour combinations. Put some dark green in the stems and added some lines around the outside. So you can see how starting off with that simple technique, you can get some quite pretty results. I hope you enjoyed today's project. If you're a beginner, there's no need to spend a lot of money on expensive materials. If you did enjoy today's project, consider giving me a like and click on that bell.